Welcome everybody. My name is Max Orr and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this Carolina Public Humanities Adventures and Ideas seminar, The Global Challenge of Religious Freedom. It's a delight to be here at Flyleaf Books, our home away from home, where we've been able to set up this virtual studio so that we can reach you with high quality content. We can't wait to be here live with all of you, and we hope soon enough that we're on the end stages of this whole thing. We all can hope, and I'm feeling a sense of optimism. But I am delighted, regardless, that you have joined us in this format to do this today. I want to quickly explain what Carolina Public Humanities is, who we are, and what we do. We are the College of Arts and Sciences outreach arm for public outreach. We serve the entire state of North Carolina by making sure that the great scholarship and faculty at UNC are shared through a number of programs, including public programs like we have here, extensive teacher workshops with our subsidiary, Carolina K-12, and a very extensive state outreach program with community colleges and libraries throughout the state. I urge you to go to humanities.unc.edu to find out what we are and look for upcoming programs and whatnot. So check that out. You can also see what we do on Facebook and other social media organs. I want to thank, of course, our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley, who have been wonderful partners in promoting especially our Carolina K-12 teacher workshops. Another incredibly important partner for our Carolina K-12 workshops is the North Caroliniana Society, who have been funding many of our workshops, including our special Teaching Hard History workshops. Well, we certainly want to thank Carolina Meadows, a retirement community in Chapel Hill, who support both our public programming and our K-12 programming. And finally, our wonderful partner, the GAA, the General Alumni Association of the University of North Carolina. Anyone can join the GAA, and they have wonderful discounts for a lot of programs, and of course, they're great partners in promoting and putting on programs with us. To do all of our work requires a bit of organization and, of course, requires some funding. So I want to let all of you know that if you're interested in helping us with our missions, especially our missions to K-12 teachers and to community colleges throughout the state, you can donate to Carolina Public Humanities, and I believe Paul will be dropping in some links for you in the chat. So again, I want to thank, I thanked many of our sponsors. I also thanked our sponsor, Flyleaf Books. Remember, Flyleaf Books is open for business, so there's plenty of opportunities for you to come in and browse. They have a limited availability for browsing, but you can order online, and certainly we want to encourage everyone to honor your local independent bookstore. Without them, we are lost. So we have a few people also to thank at Carolina Public Humanities, including the man without nothing happens, Paul Bonici, who I'm looking at about 12 feet away from me, who's running all the behind scenes. Back up at the mother base, we have Vicki Breeden, who's monitoring all of the activities today. Brian Ensminger, who got you all set up here today as our registrar. Two people who will be joining us tomorrow, Lloyd Kramer, our fearless director, who right now is with our good friends Hank and Diane Parfit at the City Center Gallery and Bookstore in Fayetteville. So again, independent bookstores, we love that. And of course, Joanna Smith, our colleague here who runs our state outreach and who will be our final speaker tomorrow morning. This seminar took almost all of Carolina Public Humanities, so I certainly want a big shout out to Susan Landstrom, our business manager, and Christy Norris, our K-12 director, so we don't leave anyone out from Carolina Public Humanities. It takes a village. Quickly, I want to explain the order of events. I'll be speaking, we have a list of them here, and they're kind of going in reverse order. So go from bottom to top, and you'll see the order in which we'll be speaking. Each of us will speak for about an hour, 50 to 60 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And we want to remind you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there if you'd like to get some questions to us. This is a really interesting topic, and I'm very happy to have been able to do some work thinking about this because it's in the news all the time. So let's get right to thinking about broadly what we're trying to do with all three of our talks. And boy, I'm going to start right out. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Some of you might get the reference there. That was a little nod to Monty Python, of course. They were, of course, truly the experts on this topic today. So religious freedom. It's a tricky and complicated subject, clearly, and I'm glad to share my perspectives on it tonight, but I really look forward to learning a lot from my colleagues over the evening and in the morning. So what is the essence of the problem we are talking about? In 3 steps, this is how I see the issue. 1, most religions are founded on conceived and adopted absolute universal truths. 2, but the world is full of people who don't share the same religion or truths. And 3, polities, states, communities that have power over a religiously pluralistic people must find a practical way to accept difference and avoid conflict. In other words, political rule and religious belief of the populace rarely line up completely with 100% belief in every citizen and every person in the government. So many leaders, even in pre-modern settings, have had to find a practical way of negotiating this difference, this issue, while maintaining peace and power. And the seeds of religious freedom are found in this negotiation of difference. And while the historical record doesn't offer any examples of completely religiously free societies, the antithesis of this, the Spanish Inquisition example, if you will, is actually more of an outlier in the historical record. Now, to be clear, religious discrimination is much closer to a historical constant, but most powers that persecute, based on religion, acknowledge and know that there's a limit to forcing conformity on the populace. For most of human history, people in power have been tied to a strong religious identity and institutions, or even the religious leader is the political power. In such circumstances, religious freedom will always be elusive and a matter of compromise rather than conviction. The best we get is toleration, which is sort of a limited agreement not to persecute those who believe in falsehoods. And we'll see that toleration need not be the policy of just the religious. Today, many states, and most developed ones, including the 3 we will look at today, have declared themselves to be non-religious to various extents and with different definitions, as we're going to see. And they've done so based on the principle of equality. Which brings us to the context of religious freedom that we're looking at today, tonight, and tomorrow. And that is what emerges or not, if this freedom is not there, so this freedom which emerges or not from the policies of a secular state regarding the religious lives of its citizens. States that follow the principle of secularism, this is me getting used to my mouth, a term coined by George Holyoake in 1871. And I want to just put a little nod out to this little book here, a very short introduction to secularism that I took a cruise through to get some ideas for today's talk. It's a great series, and of course, go to your local independent bookstore to order it. This book cites French theorist Jean Babero, who outlined 3 key traits of secularism. And here they are for you. You can read these, keep these in mind: separation of religious institutions from state institutions, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and equal treatment on grounds of religion or a non-religious view. This is how societies hope to maintain equal and fair treatment for their citizens. So these are some concepts that I wanted to sort of start out with, get a sense of how we might think about these ideas as we learn about the situation in France, as we learn about the situation in China, and as we learn about the situation in the United States. And maybe we can expand to other countries in our panel discussion tomorrow. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Max Orr. Thank you, Max. That was wonderful. You really set it up nicely, giving us some things to think about. Sorry, I'm being cheeky, folks. All right. I'll be talking about this in France. One interesting thing is that all 3 of our countries that we're looking at have contemporary issues directly related to religious freedom, which is, of course, we always find connections between the historical past and the present, but we really have some cases to look at right now in France, in the United States, and in China. So let's get right to France. Samuel Paty was brutally murdered on October 16th, 2020, on the street by someone who committed the act in defense of this person's conception of Islam. I want to be clear about this. This was an act of religious extremism. Padi taught middle school in an area with a large Muslim population. He was teaching about free speech, and he used the example of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, which had been targeted in a terrorist attack in January 2015 for depicting the Prophet Muhammad in a satirical cartoon. Those attacks and subsequent attacks kicked off debates about the secular state's duties to provide security, guarantee freedom, and respect the rights of religion, and also decide which takes precedence when weighing out the priorities for a state. While there were strong differences of opinion, large swaths of both the right and the left felt strongly that the claims of free speech and security trumped the claims of religious worship. In other words, though Charlie Hebdo routinely mocked politicians, especially on the right, everybody lined up in solidarity with the journalist's right to free speech, and everybody was Charlie. Je suis Charlie. Attacks on the Bataclan nightclub and other locations in November of 2015 gave momentum to political forces that for long had been crafting legislation to control the exercise of Islam in France, including successful passages of bills limiting Muslim dress, all done in the name of secularism. When Samuel Paty was murdered last year for referencing France's recent tragedies, naturally he became an extension of these debates and gave further impetus for the politicians who were pandering to a receptive public to put further laws on the books to neutralize the, quote, threat of Islamic extremism, unquote. Extremism, they claim, stemmed from Muslim separatism, a threat to be countered by a new law against separatism. So I want to quickly review this law and look at some of its clauses. This law has already passed in the lower house, the National Assembly, and will be passed in the Senate later this month and will become law in France. Let's review its clauses. It has new laws against hate speech. The whole notion of hate speech is not high in the French legal tradition and is implicitly aimed at speeches within mosques. It has clauses for controlling organizations and requiring Muslim organizations to sign, quote, a Republican contract of engagement. It controls homeschooling and sporting organizations, forcing similar contracts to be signed and monitoring to be administered. It has special laws targeting Muslim practices, and I should add that many of these practices are incredibly rare among the Muslim community in France. So such practices as virginity certification, polygamy, forced marriages. And again, some of these practices are not even related to Muslim, but are cultural practices related to ethnicity. And again, rarely practiced in the majority of the Muslim population in France. Other clauses for monitoring foreign funding of religious organizations with limits on the amount of funding allowed and reporting regimens, and certainly ability to monitor foreign imams in order to resist extremist lessons. Policing places of worship, including the right to shutter institutions temporarily to remove quote-unquote separatist preachers, and extending the ban on religious symbols such as the hijab in public spaces. Bear in mind that the veil has already, or the hijab or veil has already been banned in schools in 2004, and the full burqa was banned in public spaces in 2012. This goes beyond just publicly funded or publicly owned or funded organizations, but to all private organizations that contract with the Republic would be required to follow these new dress requirements. All of this is done in the name of freedom and respect for religious diversity. Supposedly, they apply to all citizens equally, but the terms really indicate its true aim: control of Muslims' religious life. The reactions were quick, and the protests pointed directly at the particular brand of secularism in France called laïcité. a word we'll come across a lot in this lecture, as in the protests here. Your laïcité, our freedom. President Macron defended himself. He had put forward this law of separatism, especially against the critical U.S. press, said, quote, laïcité means neutrality of the state. In no way does it mean the removal of religion from society in the public arena. But, he goes on, laïcité goes beyond the concept of secularism, embracing the strict neutrality of the state. So how does the French state that has expressed aims of equality and fairness for all justify special laws aimed at religious practice and religious institutions? Again, it does it in the name of secularism and in this version, this supposedly untranslatable idea, laïcité. This laïcité reflects assimilationist philosophy and an anti-communitarian stance of French republicanism. It is a central idea in the French modern political identity, but it's never been without controversy, nor accepted by all. Again, this law of separatism will become the law of France unless some miracle happens in the Senate and President Macron changes his mind. The far right in France does not think this law goes far enough. So back to laïcité and putting it in the context of French republicanism. What is it again? To begin with, it's a core concept in republicanism. It came into practice, though, in the early 20th century. Its origins are far earlier, especially in the French Revolution, but as a word in public policy, it is of relatively recent origin, as you'll see later in this talk. And while republicanism, in general, has divided more than united the French in its long history, the majorities among the left and right today support laïcité and claim it allows for the control of religious expression in life. Again, the French insist it's untranslatable, but we're going to keep using secularism and laïcité somewhat interchangeably in this talk. And we're also going to see that it's never been strictly adhered to. So let's think about freedom of religion in France. How might we make a comparative definition of it in the context of a sort of broader concept of freedom of religion? And the simplest answer, and one you'll hear a lot, and one we'll see doesn't actually match reality entirely, can be found by comparing freedom of religion in France to freedom of religion as articulated in the American Constitution. And this is the formula you'll hear often. Where America protects religion from the state, France protects the state from religion. Again, this is an oversimplification and one that has misleading implications too. The new law of separatism is meant to uphold this principle by protecting the institutions that are promoted and supported by the state from the encroachment of religion. Like everything, laïcité has a history, and this lecture is going to review the development and implementation of this idea and reveal how its principles have been applied, ignored, reimagined, and forced to fit historical circumstances. What I think you'll find in the end of this lecture is that the vagaries we're going to uncover will reveal that multiculturalism itself is as much a challenge to France's conception of itself as any religious practice or institution. But before we can get into understanding multiculturalism, we got to go back to the time when France was a little bit of a simpler country and the Roman Catholic Church was dominant. This is, of course, perhaps the most famous building in Paris, the Notre Dame Cathedral. After the tragic fire a few years ago, the French Republic ensured the world that it would rebuild it. Why? Is France a Catholic nation? Is this the duty of the Republic to do this? Well, let's start with some data. Technically, professed Catholics still make up just over 50% of the populace. But among Catholics in France, only about 7% attend Mass regularly, and even fewer attend Mass weekly. Many bemoan, and certainly strict Catholics in France definitely bemoan, what they call the death of Catholicism in France. In fact, religion in general is not doing well in France when it comes to adherence. About 40% of the French populace profess no religion at all. And I hope in the panel discussion we can talk about this religion, no religion, the fastest growing religion in the world by a mile. So we can discuss that certainly in the panel session or at any time you have a question about that. 64% of French people between the ages of 15 and 29 claim no religion. So that looks like these numbers for the whole populace will be going up in the future. Which brings us to the second largest religion by adherents in France, and that is Islam. With 5 to 6% of the population, this is the largest Muslim population in Europe outside of Turkey. And just as an aside, even within the Muslim populations, you're seeing a decline in Muslim worship among youth adherents in France as well. The most devout practicing Muslims in France tend to be more recent immigrants, first or second generation. So France is secular or secularizing? Sure. Yeah, a lot of places are. Most European countries have seen a decline in faith due to the developing modernity of the 20th century, including the growth of scientific knowledge, liberal ideas, consumer culture. But France, more than any other nation, can also tie this development to government policy. France's conception of what the state is, how it should rule, and the justification for its actions vis-a-vis religion are inherently tied to her historical relationship with the Catholic Church and her government's reaction to its influence. It's a long history. As we were talking with Aaron Keck at the Hill, and I said we're going to start with Clovis. We're going all the way back to the first Frankish king. Here we have Clovis, king of the Franks, first Merovingian king of France, converting to Christianity shortly after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This occurred in 508 CE. France soon becomes a bulwark for Christendom, the fortress of Western Europe that saves all of Western Europe in the Battle of Tours against the Arab invasions. Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope. Throughout medieval history, we see French kings as champion of the Roman Catholic Church, taking the lead in crusades, instituting and funding religious institutions, rewarding church officers with favors, instituting favorable tax and legal systems for the clergy and institutions, and other perks. French kings were decidedly on the side of the church in suppressing religious freedom and cooperated or led in the persecution of Christian heresies, Jews, and other religious minorities. France was decidedly Catholic polity, and few questioned the church's authority to determine religious faith or the belief of its people. There were disagreements, of course, between church and state, sometimes very serious, including kings imprisoning popes, but there was no firm principle keeping a firewall between secular and religious authority. Well, at the roots of these disagreements were often political considerations. In the feudal society of reciprocity, there were rights and duties for the state and rights and duties for the church, but they were composite pieces of one system of rule. As France consolidated and its kings began to exert more control, the relationship with the church changed. The church was part of France's ruling order, and France's kings wanted more independence in its governance. Hard-pressed by the invasion of Italy by imperial and French forces in the early 16th century, the church played off the major powers through concessions. And in the early 16th century, we see the signing in 1516 of the Concordat of Bologna, signed between Francis I of France and Pope Leo X, the Pope, who was a Medici. This created what was called the Gallican Church. It gave special privileges to the king in areas of investiture of bishops and other details of French rule within France. And the state now has more control over certain religious institutions. It provided a special concession to the French to remain within the Roman Catholic Church, but to get some special treatment. And I want you to look at that year, 1516. This was, of course, 1 year before Luther's Reformation, which sends Europe into a tailspin of religious hatred and violence. Oops, excuse me, I have a little shot there, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. I forgot the word day there, I see that. The Reformation introduced the first modern European iterations of the acceptance of difference, but not of religious freedom for individuals within polities. In 1555, we see the Peace of Augsburg's formula of cuius regio, eius religio, granted rulers religious freedom, but gave them the right to determine the faith of their people. And this is certainly not disinterested secularism. France's own Reformation history, which we have a picture here of some of the violence, included a long struggle between Protestants, known as Huguenots, as I'm sure all of you know, and Catholics in the wars of religion, the resolution of which might determine the faith of the nation. I'm sure you know the story of Henry IV decides to pragmatically convert to Catholicism because it was the majority religion. And while he did that, he had the first pragmatic concession to religious freedom in French history, which was the Edict of Nantes. It's more of a policy of toleration, but it gave some rights to Protestants and certainly kept the peace. The famous revocation of this edict by Louis XIV in 1685 was more about consolidating royal power than a matter of faith, not to deny that there was strong religious sentiments behind it. But it firmly pulled the Catholic Church into the power structure of a now centralized and powerful monarchy, confirming its place as the first estate in the three orders of French society. It creates an underclass of Protestants, unrecognized without privileges, but still in France despite some mass emigration. And of course, there were Jewish people who were not accorded rights either. The Church enjoyed special privileges that angered the lower classes, and while Catholic practice was declining in the 18th century, the Catholic Church had even more power. The Revolution will overturn the French religious practice belief, but the real aim of its policies were targeting the political, social, and economic power of a conservative Catholic Church. So it's clear that if you're going to dismantle this system of control, part of that is to dismantle the church. And the first step to structural reform was to undertake ideological reform by removing the insistence on a public acceptance of one religious truth and formally codifying religious freedom. This was one of the first acts of the National Assembly, the creation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789. And Article 10, as you can see, says, "No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law." Again, note the change from universal truths to opinions and views. Also note that last clause, as long as it doesn't disturb the public order established by law. These will have implications clearly for religious freedom. So to be clear, this is not just a cynical power grab. It genuinely reflected Enlightenment ideas about toleration and about a secular rational state. These were in high currency during this age of reason, but there were also political implications, and it was helped to dismantle a power structure. The current French Fifth Republic Constitution still has the Declaration embedded in it. And of course, this principle is where we can see the seeds of the modern concept of laïcité, which will develop a century out. During the Revolution itself, it was a bad time for religious freedom. It is certainly what we see as a series of draconian reforms. And they reveal two sides of secularism in action. One is removing religion from political power, generally considered good by maybe contemporary liberal standards, but also interfering into the practice of religion, generally considered bad by modern liberal standards. There were political, financial, and indeed ethical reasons for the confiscation of church lands, the abolishment of ecclesiastical courts, and the removal of special privileges. But these revolutionaries went further by instituting a state hierarchy over the church in the civil constitution of the clergy, and demanding that all clergy swear an oath to the government and persecuting those who don't. The fierce resistance of the church and Catholics only heightened the revolution's growing, what is coming to be termed anti-clericalism. With all refractory clergy, those that refused to sign the oath, painted as enemies loyal to a foreign prince, in this case, of course, the Pope. The revolutionaries didn't see religious difference, they saw a threat. The Revolutionary Republic, failing to negotiate religious difference, tried a number of initiatives, from de-Christianization to creating its own religions, but it never solved the problem of religious difference, and it certainly didn't rule by the dictates of secular religious freedom in the sense that we want to understand. They could liberate the Protestants and the Jews, and did, but couldn't resolve this conflict with the Catholic Church. They liked order and obedience, but faced the reality of citizens who continued to want to practice Catholicism as they saw fit and were willing to take arms to do it. It was the primary destabilizer of France in the 1790s and would only be resolved after Napoleon's coup. So Napoleon to the rescue. This is a ridiculous painting of Napoleon barely clothed, bringing the Concordat of 1801 to solve the problem of religious difference in France. What did the Concordat do? It made Catholicism the recognized, quote, religion of the majority of the people, but grants no favors and promises freedom of religion to all faiths. This is the concession to the Catholic Church by the government of France, is recreating sort of a version of the old Gallican Church, but with much more power for the state. With some modifications over time, the Concordat remained in effect until 1905, despite several regime changes. What does it do? Well, it abolishes the constitutional church, reconfirms state investiture, and interestingly covers all clergy salaries, allows priests to teach in public schools, and grants other concessions to the church to be involved in public life. Of course, after Napoleon has this Concordat, resolves France's religious problems, he eventually treats Catholics and the popes pretty shabbily, even imprisoning Pope Pius, earning the ire of devout Catholics and the condemnation of the church. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic years engendered a strong right-wing Catholic discourse against anything that followed the Ancien regime when the church had it good. And this is also another key building block in why laïcité became so militant, as we're going to see. The counter-revolutionary church was vociferous in its claims. With the exception of a brief period of time in the Second Republic, every regime between Napoleon and the Third Republic enjoyed relatively cozy relations with the church. The church had found a new form of power, though, in the realm of public opinion. It became the mouthpiece of the political right wing, and strong Catholic faith became synonymous with ultra-royalism and counter-revolution. French clergy led the charge in branding any progressive idea as revolution, and also as a sin, as an opening to the door to hell. This was not politically disinterested faith, a politically disinterested faith, but was a militant player in French domestic politics. These characters on the screen here are left-wing mockeries of church mission movements in the 1820s, which, while attempting to regenerate faith after the revolution, were also essentially political rallies. And I just want to note the one on the left is making a point about freedom of religion, where we have the Pope oppressing members of different faiths. You can see there a Muslim, a Protestant, a Jew, and an Eastern Orthodox person, all under the Pope's control or under the Pope's domination. They become proponents of ultramontanism, advocating the primacy of the Pope, again a foreign prince, and consider the church as the only effective bulwark against revolutionary backsliding. So we have this ultra-politicized Catholicism, supported by royalist regimes and politicians. It was a force in France that was decidedly anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian, anti-progress. It was also, for many modern sensibilities, too irrational. 19th century Catholic Church throughout Europe was characterized by a romantic revival of faith and reaction. It was an age of new miracles, Our Lady of Lourdes, the Immaculate Conception of Mary. It was an age of pilgrimages, of ostentatious piety. This was the first age for those mass-produced tacky Catholic statues and iconography that some of you might remember from maybe your grandmother had one. The church was incompatible with growing belief in the primacy of reason, which was dominating the secular world. right? The primacy of reason and science showing progress. One part of society is going on that route, and the other part of society is in a more romantic, irrational appreciation of human experience. What about that rational side? Well, while the 19th century church was becoming more obscurantist and reactionary, the French left and center-left high society was becoming increasingly attached to reason in secular life. And many are becoming adherents of the ideas of Auguste Comte and his philosophy of positivism. Comte is considered one of the founders of sociology, had a lot of interesting ideas, but I want to cut to the chase with a main idea, and that is the complete removal of metaphysical and abstract ideals from the explanation, analysis, and interaction with the natural and the social world. It's a philosophy that emphasizes observation, reason, and action. It's a perfect philosophy for a century of scientific progress and colonial conquest. Positivism has a slogan, order and progress, and places them in a symbiotic relationship. Alas, the uber-rational Comte came through his quasi-romantic relationship with the writer Clotilde de Vaux to accept that there is some spiritual side to human nature that also needed nurturing. So naturally, he created a new religion of humanity, a sort of church of ethics. So there's Comte there, and here's you can still see this building, the religion of humanity. Again, a sort of secular church where you could touch your spiritual side, but you weren't beholden to irrationality. The key development to trace here is that because religion deals with the unquantifiable, Comte thought it should have no place in public life or in public policy. Religion is private, the public is positivist. Religion would influence many people in power. Excuse me, not religion, it would too, but there are plenty of religious people in power in France, but I meant to say this philosophy of positivism will influence many people in power in the Third Republic. And just as an aside, they really loved Comte in Brazil, and the flag of Brazil, of course, still has emblazoned on it order and progress. So these Republicans, people like Gambetta, Favre, Ferry, when finally in power in the late 1870s, just to be clear, the first few years of the Third Republic, 1870 to 1877 or so, were controlled by conservative politicians. But when these folks get into power, the true Republicans get into power, they put positivism to work to guide society to progress through order and to order through progress. They believe this stuff. They use centralized power in a campaign of systemization, homogenization, and rationalization. And I want to give a nod to this classic book by Eugen Weber, The Peasants into Frenchmen, which describes in detail the Third Republic's complete overhaul of France through reforms of the judicial and school systems, the army, the church, railways, roads, the market economy, cultural practices, and the people themselves who lost native languages and customs. Now, one doesn't have to be cynical to understand that there are less lofty, more material goals and incentives for these programs. But ostensibly, this is an honorable project. And we want to understand the ideas here, so we're going to take it at face value that this is done for the following reasons. The goal for the French Republicans was to ensure liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, and to make clear to all that the Republic was the only body that could guarantee that for you, that could guarantee the liberties in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Citizens must all be equal, at least in opportunity, and the cumulative effect of all of these reforms left a more equal and homogenized population. Equality demanded, however, that no citizen should have recourse to resources, obey orders from, or owe allegiance to any other social organization. The French called this threat to their project, this threat to equality, they called it communalisme, translated sort of communitarianism. And it's a threat to equality because it's also a threat, and if it's a threat to equality, it's a threat to liberty and fraternity as well. This law on separatism uses this as its justification. The state can brook no rivals, and of course it has one very big one, and that is the Catholic Church. So while these rational Republicans inherited positivism and did all this, they also inherited generational partisan anti-clericalism and brought it into power with them. Here's a caricature that you could find any number of caricatures of Catholic teachers, Catholic people praying, young, stupid Catholic students, etc., etc. These types of caricatures filled the left-wing press. To be sure, the venomous rhetoric of the reactionary church and its right-wing adherents was balanced by this consensus, strident anti-clericalism in the French left. And it really was an ugly anti-religious sentiment, often. But the reality is, this republic faces a hostile Catholic population, fed on over 70 years of counter-revolutionary, anti-democratic discourse that did not hide its ultimate desire for a new government, or rather, the old government, if you will. The majority of France's right-wing politicians, its army officers, and much of its peasant population strongly identified as Catholic. And this internal threat is exacerbated by an external threat, the ultra-conservative late 19th century papacy that explicitly condemned democracy in all of its forms, strengthened its power by declaring papal infallibility, and used the pulpit and the classroom to spread the word. Now, while other communitarian threats existed in the Third Republic, like trade unions, the church was clearly the greatest threat politically to the Third Republic. I want to make a key point here. Republican anti-clericalism was not hating Catholicism or religion solely for what it was or what it professed, but for what it did to threaten the very existence of the Republic. And the militancy that you see today in France's defense of secularism bears this legacy. And here's the irony, right? Yet, the state was still paying clergy, and many of them were in the classroom. And so schools become this sort of familiar battleground in the secular religious contest. And Catholics had gained the upper hand in the schools in the 19th century. Catholics and Royalists had branded public education in the mid-19th century as a breeding ground for modern Republican, liberal, and later socialist ideas. Le plus ça change, le plus même chose. When in power in the 1850s, they passed a series of laws that dismantled the centralized imperial public school system. And these new laws allowed for more local, and that means more Catholic control of educational councils that hired the teachers, and greatly subsidized teaching clergy that local communities chose. The net result was an increase in the number of Catholic schools and the children going to them. When Republicans come into power, they are not going to let this stand. The Ferry laws, named after French politician Jules Ferry, starting in the 1880s, restricted clerical teaching, reasserted the central standards and authority, and instituted a decidedly Republican curriculum. They funded, built, and staffed local schools throughout the country, bringing the Republic into direct contact with all of the citizens, and made school mandatory up to 13 years old. The Republicans saw the school as a Republican equalizer, an essential organ in the reordering of French society that I outlined earlier. This is only going to anger the right wing, and I won't get into all of the ways that various ways the right wing had been angered in the course of the Third Republic, to the point that when a flashpoint hit that all of you are very familiar with, and that is the Dreyfus affair, because we all have watched Jaws, where you really see the Royalist Catholics become aligned with an anti-assimilationist, anti-Semitic group of anti-Dreyfusards. Here we have La Croix. This was the Assumptionist Order's newspaper organ, which was filled with vile anti-Semitism throughout the Dreyfus affair. They attached themselves to a movement that can only be described as proto-fascist, which embraced, fed, and spread vicious hate, lies, and conspiracies, and wished openly for the collapse of the Republic. The affair's happy resolution, in that, Dreyfus is eventually exonerated and rehabilitated, redounded well on French republicanism. The Republic had come to the defense of a citizen who was targeted for his faith, and showed itself to be a defender of religious liberty. The Republic also showed that it believed in the principle of equality and accepted and treated citizens of all faiths and cultures equally. It was an acceptance of difference within French identity. Or was it? We'll see. And this was a victory. This was a vindication for Republican ideas, and the Republicans acted. They passed 2 laws to finally put the nail in the coffin of this great contestation. They instituted laïcité as official policy. This is where we begin to see the word in official French documents. And a series of laws, 2 laws passed. The 1901 Law of Associations closed 1,500 religious establishments and dismissed 37,000 priests, 120,000 nuns, all in the name of anti-communalism. These were associations, Republicans said. They were closed because they were aligned with authorities outside of France. Many of the charters of these very associations, religious orders, had clauses specifically contravening the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was a closure of all the monasteries and nunneries, many of which had been unauthorized, and none of those monks and nuns would be allowed to teach. If you want to be a monk, get out of France. It was a punishment of secular clergy who protested. And this one is actually remembered almost more. They get conflated with the next law, but this one really had a big effect on public opinion, certainly embittered many Catholics. In 1905, they go one step further with the law of separation of church and state. And this states that there was freedom with religion without prejudice, reconfirming Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, revokes the whole Concordat, and takes over all lay education. It meant freedom for all and any religion in state schools or institution. It cuts ties to priests, Protestant ministers, rabbis. It confiscates church property and trusts churches to lay associations. And this, of course, is a legacy and memory of the big bad state that came through and did inventories and looked at all of the value of all of the local churches and confiscated everything and turned it over to the citizens to run the church. This is the memory that still is a scar for many devout Catholics in France. But the question is just how separate did the law of separation make the church and state? First of all, there were many immediate exceptions to the ban on clergy teaching, as they were often the only option. They would still be paid as teachers, not as clergy, of course, but they're the same person in the same classroom. Even today, in France, Catholic schools still teach close to 20% of students. And though these are regulated and teachers' salaries are paid by the state, again, we're talking about ostensible secular separation of church and state. So long as they teach the state curriculum, all is fine. Again, they are subsidized by the state and are low cost, as are several Jewish schools in France. Nearly all pre-1905 physical houses of worship, 90% of Catholic churches in France, 50% of Protestant houses of worship, 10% of synagogues are still state subsidized for upkeep, and yet are often still houses of worship. In the reoccupied areas of Alsace-Lorraine after World War I, the French state built churches and paid clergy in a re-Francification of the area. Suddenly, one needs an active Catholic Church to be truly French. This is the same republic that promotes laïcité. So this brings us back to where we began. What really is the relationship between laïcité and the recent laws against separatism that have passed in France? We've seen the Christian exceptions to laïcité and concessions to other faiths, but let's consider the treatment of Islam. There are no state-sponsored Muslim schools in France, despite the fact that Islam is the second highest practiced religion. Efforts have been quashed. Whole petitions have been made to quash these efforts, where Muslims have sought to use unused churches as mosques, and whole petitions have been gathered to squash these efforts, and politicians have lined up to not allow Muslims to use churches, empty churches, as mosques. Muslim headscarves, famously, and supposedly other ostentatious religious symbols are banned in classrooms, but school menus serve fish on Fridays, and the Christian holidays define the entire school calendar. The inconsistencies here suggest something else is afoot. In a largely non-believing nation full of towns and people named for Christian saints, Christian identity has been detached from Catholic practice. Far-right candidate in France, and I fear to say likely next president, Marine Le Pen, said in 2015, quote, "If French Muslims want to practice their faith, they need to accept the fact that they are doing so on soil that is culturally Christian." And she herself professes to believe in laïcité, at least in public. France's institution of laïcité against the Catholic Church was like a divorce between longtime married couple who continue to cohabitate. They're too comfortable where they are, and they have a history. France's relationship with Islam is very different. This discrimination also has a history. And it was in another land, decidedly not Christian, and not Christian soil, where we find its origins. In colonial Algeria in the 19th century, the French made adherence or non-adherence to Islam the determination for citizenship. In a law from 1865, this is before the Third Republic, I should add, the French state declared that Algerians must reject Muslim civil status to be eligible for full citizenship. I'll give you the text of the law. Quote, "The Muslim indigenous is French. However, he will continue to be subjected to Muslim law. He may, on his demand, be admitted to enjoy the rights of a French citizen. In this case, he is subjected to the political and civil laws of France." The implicit trade-off here is abandon all the functions of your faith that serve you in public life, and that is a lot of Sharia law, in order to become French. Few qualify, few would take advantage of this. This was a nod to universal rights offered with an unreasonable demand. The French Republicans, colonialist par excellence, who had the whole colonial mission as part of their mission for order and progress, the mission civilisatrice, when they took over in the Third Republic, they read this law as consistent with their distrust of communalism, no rival power. And in Algeria, the supposedly secular state thus used a religious distinction to build an ethnic apartheid regime and institute draconian rule, including special law codes like the Code de l'Indigenat that only applied to indigenous peoples. The Republicans declared Sharia law and Muslim cultural practices as incompatible with French assimilation and expanded this distinction to all colonies. Such distinctions went against the Republicans' sacred duty to strive for a universal, centralized, and rational state in the service of all humanity's order and progress, and to not make distinctions based on religion. And even in the final throes of the Algerian War, you can see the French still attacked Muslim identity and practice as different and contrasted it with the notion of freedom offered by French secularism. This is, don't you feel pretty? Deveil yourself. Be free. You can be free like French. And of course, we're talking about a different form of freedom than civic freedom, but the point still remains. If you want to assimilate, get rid of your Muslim practice. Since the end of the French Revolution, no Catholic has been denied citizenship in France based on their religion. Now, today, we don't have the time to tell the story of the hundreds of thousands of Muslim Algerians, other North Africans, sub-Saharan Muslims who came to France in the 20th century to work well before independence and whose descendants, sometimes in fifth, even sixth generations, make up 5 to 6% of the French population. Nor do we have time to discuss the transformation of colonial subjects into French citizens during the era of decolonization. Nor do we have time for the whole story of France's hunger for even more workers and the invitation of Muslim migrant workers to come to a labor-hungry France after decolonization. Or how they came with families and settled, and when the slump hit in the 1970s, they felt less welcome as they watched recession and deindustrialization ravage their communities. And we can't go into the details now of how, too predictably, they saw economic depression and desperation of others around them get manipulated into nativist racism against them. But all of those things happen in the course of the 20th century. And now we're in a situation where racism, akin to that which animated the anti-Dreyfusards, has found its way back into mainstream political discourse in France. But this time, secularism marches in front as cover. The principle of laïcité, wielded as a defensive shield against a genuine political threat in the Catholic Church, has been marshaled as a tool in a political struggle against multiculturalism. The cultural traits of Islam remain targets in this new politics. So here's the paradox. By the principle of laïcité, allowing religious freedom for Muslim practices and institutions was cause to deny them citizenship in the French colonial setting. Now that principle of laïcité is used to justify a restriction of practices and institutions in France proper, where most Muslims are in fact citizens. It seems like Muslims can't win anywhere under French rule. The ostensibly anti-racist left and center may have a lot of true believers in laïcité. Secularists at heart who see accommodation to difference as surrender to superstition. But for the cynical, there are votes in racism, and secularism provides cover. And there's good evidence for this cynicism. The veil controversies, which some of you might have been aware of, have been taking place over the last few decades. These were preventing female Muslim students from wearing hijab in school. These always coincided with the threat of right-wing success in politics in 1989, in 1994, and in 2004, when a ban law was finally passed. In all of those times, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Daddy Le Pen, was gaining steam, and the centrists stole his show. Good Republicans could claim they backed such initiatives not because they didn't like seeing France look foreign, but because the school is the sacred Republican training ground. And that's exactly how they expressed it. Today, Macron is not polling well against Marine Le Pen. And so he doubles down on laïcité like a good Republican while sending dog whistles to today's anti-Dreyfusards. So let's return to the main cliched iteration of religious freedom in France. That over there, it means protect the state from religion. Some have suggested the problem here is the near sacralization of laïcité, that it has become like a state religion, and France a secular theocracy. I'm more cynical than that. Laïcité was born out of political contestation. It was a philosophy that helped justify a political move, however necessary at the time, and it is now being deployed cynically by the right wing for racist reasons, and by Macron and centrists, and even some leftists, for political survival. I sympathize with those in France who have died at the hands of extremists. Those are tragic acts committed by dangerous people, but they're few in number. These dangerous people are few in number, and they're not representative of a religion of 4 million diverse French Muslims. They can and are tracked and caught by markers that have nothing to do with their faith. And frankly, these terrorists are not a threat to the state laïcité is supposed to defend. The law of separation, done in the name of laïcité, clearly violates Bobbereau's third principle of secularism, those principles I started out with, equal treatment on grounds of religion or non-religious worldview. Finally, I must confess, I admire some of the principles of laïcité. It's a conception of religious freedom that's closer to my ideas than the American one, although I have a little bit of both in me. But as this lecture has shown, that the relatively simple maxims of secularism are ideal in form, but here on earth, history, culture, and politics make things very messy. And now, as our dear friend Gerhard Weinberg says, it's your turn.
Okay, Max, can you hear the applause?
I can.
can.
I've said that line too, Paul.
I know. I'm just going to do a poor imitation of Max here.
Oh, you do me better than me.
Thank you. All right, so we have a couple of questions already. One that was sort of answered, but our question asker also disagrees. So this is from our friend Jonathan Gerard, and he says, Max, how do you understand the Dreyfus trial? Was it a message to Jews and all other minorities to stop pushing for liberalization, i.e. another pendulum swing to the right? Or was it just another random manifestation of anti-Semitism? Or was he guilty? Why does the event continue to reverberate today?
He wasn't guilty. He clearly wasn't guilty. That's we have so much evidence, all of the fake news and all of the, you could go back through and it's clear that he wasn't guilty. Esterhazy was the person. It's certainly a manifestation of rabid anti-Semitism, which had been growing in the 19th century, of course, throughout Europe and especially in France, especially as we began to get more Eastern European Jewish people coming into France. There had always been, for example, if you're a Catholic in France and you're looking back at a time when Catholics had privileges and had, and Jews didn't, the idea that the French Revolution, which destroyed your faith, got rid of the kings that you had admired, and at the same time gave benefits to this other group, that is going to be a trigger within the French context for dislike of Jews, be they assimilated, like Dreyfus was very much an assimilated. Dreyfus did not really focus on his Jewish identity at all. He focused on his French identity. And in a way, Dreyfus was playing the laïcité game correctly. Religion was private. He was very much just a French gentleman soldier in his public life, and his private life was Jewish. So I think I think it's a little bit of all of those things, except for that he's not guilty. You have a political reason. That's again, they're all tied together. You can't pull the politics and the anti-Semitism apart, but you have a political reason for distrusting or disliking the idea of Jewish liberation in the context of a changing polity, that you're nostalgic for the old one, and combined with just straight up anti-Semitism. I think the interesting thing about the Dreyfus case is that it gave the French Republic a chance to sort of champion the idea that for all of Dreyfus as being a case of justice and figuring out what who really did the crime and exonerating the person who wasn't guilty, it really was also a vindication of the idea of French secularism. Look, that French secularism defends religious minorities, and the French Republic could lean on that. It certainly is going to fuel, it doesn't make the right wing any less anti-Semitic. In fact, it actually increases it, and we only have to look at France's behavior in World War II to see just sort of the echoes of that just coming back 40 years later. But I think it's a combination of all those things, except for, of course, Dreyfus's guilt. I hope I've answered Jonathan's question. I hate to think that I'm disagreeing with Jonathan on some of these things, but feel free to ask another one, Jonathan, if I didn't get it correctly for you there.
So funny you should mention that. He did ask another question, which I'll jump to because it kind of is in the same vein of the previous question. First off, he says this talk is terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
He just said, I would like to add one thing that few people know about. Napoleon convened a Sanhedrin of 70 rabbis.
Yep.
And presented them with a series of questions testing the loyalty of French Jews to France in exchange for citizenship. The Sanhedrin created Judaism as a religion, quote unquote. The rabbis enthusiastically agreed that in all matters of law which they for the first time were considered secular French Jews would follow French law. Only in matters of religious law would they maintain their Jewish identity. So how old is Judaism? And
this is a rabbi asking me how old is Judaism.
And I think his answer was about 200 years old with a smile.
There you go. Well, I appreciate that. And it is true. I mean, I want to just be clear, too. I mean, that all of this is sort of related to the Concordat of 1801 in that, the French had a ministry of cults. They had a body, a minister who would sort of help run the religions in the country. So yeah, absolutely, it becomes institutionalized and recognized as such. So yeah, I'd say, how about this? French Judaism that cooperates with the state is 200 years old? Thank you for those questions, Jonathan.
Okay, we have a question here from our good friend and board member Paul Connick, and he says, or he asks, you seem to suggest that there is something inherent in positivism that makes it conducive to colonial conquest. How so? And then the second part is, couldn't any ideology or norm, religious or secular, serve equally well to instill chauvinistic pride and rationalize the subjugation of peoples seen as too benighted to share it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have there is that it's never one thing. It's always a conflation of circumstances. Why is it that European colonialism happened in the way it happened in the 19th century? And it's not, yes, it's positivism, or the idea of progress, and the idea that, especially the particular French universalist progress, that the French state is the one that's going to make a declaration, not just for France, but for all humanity, right? This universalist notion. So certainly positivism really fits very nicely with French universalism, but it's never one particular thing. Like, there are many reasons, and rapaciousness has been, an unfortunate constant in human history. But when we think about 19th century colonialism, it's a series of pieces just coming together at the wrong time for colonial peoples and at the right time for rapacious colonialists. Those include scientific developments, transportation, public health, and also, but this ideological concepts of scientific racism, and also this positivist philosophy. I agree that there could be any number of other causes or other explanations, and we certainly can find examples that don't need positivism or don't need these ideological reasons to generate the same sort of phenomena. But in the 19th century, they just all fit together just too perfectly. And especially, I just want to emphasize, especially the positivism and the French universalism going hand in hand. And that, I always say, positivist confidence as well, right? You don't embark on these adventures unless you're confident that you can, rework Africa and turn it into a laboratory of French universalism. And I think that the positivism and the confidence that science, if we don't pay attention to metaphysical ideas, if we don't listen to abstract ideas, and we just see what works and we react to that we can, in fact, remake the world in the image of France and guarantee the rights of humanity to everybody. And of course, I say this with, one hand behind my back, because I think I've already shown you that there are plenty of ways that they, are hypocrites, to be frank.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to encourage people to submit their questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of their screen. So we have a little bit more time for questions, and we have a couple of good ones coming up from our colleague, Joanna Smith. Hey, Joanna. The first one is, you brought up the narrative that the Catholic Church in the early 1800s was incompatible with democracy. Can you tell us more about how the Church responded to this? Did it adjust its practices and teachings at all to try and prove its compatibility?
It was just not interested in that. I mean, it depends on the era. Now, you have to break. I've flattened a lot of difference in eras, but certainly, like, we can look at those caricatures from the 1820s. This is from the most really, really counter-revolutionary church that really. If you mention the word democracy to you, they'll say that is satanic. I mean, it's that extreme. So it's not like they want to become compatible with democracy at that point. And even throughout the 19th century, we see the official line from the papacy is anti-democratic, anti-nationalist. Of course, that has a lot to do with the unification of Italy and what that's doing to papal power. And certainly by the 1870s, you have a cornered church that is sort of reacting and doubling down on this. This is when we have the principle of ex cathedra, that the Pope is infallible, and the Pope is up there saying things like democracy is evil. Well, he's infallible. You're absolutely right that it changes, though. And we don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of French Third Republic politics, but by the 1880s, it was clear that the Republic was staying. I should add that the first 7 years of the French Third Republic, the people who were in charge of the French Third Republic were essentially trying to destroy the French Third Republic, or at least make it as conservative as possible and as much like a non-democratic institution as they could. They are, again, the niceties of Third Republic politics we don't have to get into, but when the Republicans take charge in the late 1870s and get into power in the 1880s and they start to enact these reforms, there are Catholics who say, we're being left out here. And there was a movement called the Ralliement, which did try to say, look, we're not taking back the things we said about how awful it is, but it was a sort of pragmatic concession to, look, if you want to get some power, you're going to have to run for office, and you're going to have to rally people to take part in the politics. The Catholic Church had become so political, but its real politics were in the realm of public opinion. They didn't want to take part in any of these institutional practices. After the Ralliement, we begin to see, right-wing Catholic politicians frankly bringing that vitriolic language right into the National Assembly. It's a series of crises in the Third Republic in which the Catholic and Royalist hopes get up in the Boulanger affair, where a general became very popular and sort of rallied a populist movement. But really, it's the Dreyfus affair where you see a sort of consolidation of really kind of actually strange bedfellows in which the Catholic Church, not all, and this is very important, I want to say, there were Catholics who were Dreyfusards, who were on the side of Alfred Dreyfus, and it was not a small minority. It was a good chunk of Catholics were on the side of the Republic. They might have been people who had been influenced by the Ralliement, took part in it, said it's not so bad, or they might have just been people who could see through the lies, etc. But it was in the Dreyfus affair that you have, that's where the dividing line comes for Catholics that are going to embrace things like fascism, that are going to be embracing, radically anti-democratic movements, and that will become their identity and be cemented in that. And then this other group of, the sort of gentler Catholics that accept the Republic, they're going to still vote for Catholic parties, going to still be conservative, going to still send their kids to Catholic school, going to still say nasty things about the Republic, but they have accepted the reality. So I hope that answers Joanna's question, but she'll let me know.
Yep. Well, you've got another chance here to answer another question.
Okay.
From Joanna. She asks, can you tell us a little bit about the power of Muslim voters in France? You've showed photos of protests. Can you describe pushback against recent laws from Muslims themselves and from other activists?
Well, it's interesting what's happening in France. I'm not an expert on contemporary French politics, so I can't really discuss, the voting numbers, how many Muslims vote. I would be interested in looking that up, could look it up tonight and have that information for you tomorrow in more detail. But what I do think is interesting is the new sort of alliance lines that are being formed. Again, I mentioned a lot of center left and even left are what I call those sort of secular champions who look at, superstition. They're not into, I might call them the Christopher Hitchens group, if you will, in French polity, that are really coalescing into kind of a group that has this particular stance on this very controversial issue. And then you see interesting coming together from even some Catholics in France who are coming out to defend the practices of Muslims, and also, of course, that whole swath of non-believers, the young non-believers, tend to be more allied with this group here on the screen here. Look at the youth. Look at that crowd in there. First of all, you'll notice that it's a multicultural crowd and tends to be pretty young looking. So what I think is interesting, I wish I could give you answers about how Muslims themselves are organizing politically. We know they are, but what I think is perhaps more hopeful is that there are allies and comrades that are developing a new sort of constituencies and new ways of sort of forming political alliances to get some political agency. Just as an aside, I mean, Macron is a new figure in French history. We had this very kind of steady right and left in French history for a number of years in the Fifth Republic, and Macron comes along and creates space in the center. And that really leaves a lot of people on one side on the left who don't like his neoliberalism, and and don't like his sort of conservative, centrist type policies. And on the right, they didn't like him when he came because he was saying nice things about multiculturalism. I don't want to be too pointed, but Macron is definitely playing a political game. His numbers are going down. His approval ratings are around 40. His 41. His disapproval ratings are, in the high 50s. Last year, he was 1 or 2 points above Marine Le Pen. Now he's 1 or 2 points below Marine Le Pen. This is pandering. This is exactly what this is. I know I've gone beyond the original question, Joanna, but just sort of situating all of this in contemporary French politics, I think it's pretty clear what's going on here. But back to your question, absolutely, Muslims organize politically, and they have allies, and there are new sort of constituencies and new political alignments that I'm not sure if they're even solidified yet, but it'll be interesting to see in 10 years what the French political landscape looks like.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from someone we know, Dr. Lloyd Kramer.
Never heard of him.
And he asks, he says, religious people often claim that secular humanism or secularism is also a kind of religion. It has sacred texts, martyrs, scapegoating hostility for people who don't share their beliefs, and a willingness to persecute those who don't share their ideas. How would you describe the difference between religious faith and the belief in secularism?
Ooh. It's interesting because I do think that I mentioned the idea that some people are claiming that, what we're seeing here is sort of religious fervor for secularism that is blinding people to even some of the, what's the word, the contradictions in some of the political statements they might normally have, but they're blinded by secularism. Rephrase the last part of the question. What is the difference between?
How do you describe the difference between religious faith and the belief in secularism?
Lloyd asked a tough question. How do I describe the difference between religious faith and the belief in secularism? I believe that if the belief in secularism is held honestly and truly, it is disinterested. It should be disinterested. It should serve to protect others rather than yourself. And it's not based on much religious belief. Is based on coming to some understanding with an ineffable truth, right? Some sublime truth, right? Secularism is not searching for that. Secularism is of course secular. It's trying to organize a society in a way that can provide equality and fairness for all of its people, not to provide salvation, insight into truth, etc. So I think there's a real distinction. Now, the way they're practiced, I think what you're getting at is that they have their sacred texts, they have all these things. Those are similarities, and perhaps if people take those to the extreme, I want to be clear, secularism is not atheism or an atheistic rule. It is an attempt to be disinterested, to not have a position on ultimate reality. So despite having sacred texts and practices and even being susceptible to abuse, as an essence of what it is supposed to be, it is a disinterest in ultimate truth and focusing on creating a fair and equal society. Just like religious faith can be susceptible to abuse and misinterpretation, I believe the same thing can be true with secularism, but at essence, secularism is not of the same category as religious truth. That's my take, and I came up with that right here, Lloyd, so we'll have to see. I would love to hear your rejoinder to that tomorrow.
Okay, we have two actually responses from two of our audience members to your response. First, Jonathan Gerard says secularism versus religion both illustrate the human need to believe in an ideology. And then Paul Connick replies, secularism doesn't claim to be underwritten by an infallible, irrefutable, transcendent authority. So would you like to respond to either of those?
I think Paul summed up what I was trying to get at there as well, is that, secularism is disinterested in the sublime questions that give us meaning and life. Secularism, it wants to set up the social and social real world conditions by which people will be able to find meaning in their lives, right? So the other is a, we have this access to a sublime truth or some, mysteries or whatever. Again, not all religions are based on revealed truth. I understand that too, but they provide an inner spiritual meaning for us. Secularism isn't trying to do that for anybody. Secularism is just trying to create the conditions by which you can do that if you want to, if you will. The idea for the need to believe in ideological, I think that's true, but I think what always happens is people always order their world according to systems. Now, certainly, if we are ordering our world to systems and not letting any evidence change our mind about what we believe, we are becoming ideological, right? But needing to have some sort of framework by which you understand your place in society, your place in relationship to perhaps a spiritual world, if you believe in a spiritual world. I would say that I think ideology might be too strong a word, but absolutely needs systems by which they can make sense of their place in society and in communities. And also, for those other questions that secularism is not going to try to answer. What happens after you die? What is the ultimate meaning of reality? Right? So there's a need for structures of thought that can place you in those situations and make sense of it. Ideology might be too strong a word, but here's the thing, they often become ideological, become sort of intractable and resistant to alternative information.
Okay, so it looks like we have one question left, and this is one from our colleague Joanna, and she asks, this might be asking you to read minds, but I'm fascinated by the idea that non-religious French citizens today would still want the country to embrace its Catholic heritage by maintaining Catholic churches. Do you have a guess about what is driving that attitude?
Well, if anyone's... look, when Notre Dame burnt down, the entire country was, save this incredible institution. I think what I'm going to have to be very careful about saying this is that, Marine Le Pen is marshaling this idea of being on a Christian soil for decidedly racist reasons. But it is also, we can't deny the cultural baggage of if you're a 25-generation French person, and whose family has got the last name Saint-Pierre or something like that, I think that this notion of, we're this is our tradition, this is who we are. I mean, it's certainly much, much stronger. In the United States, I think the Protestant tradition is incredibly strong, and of course we've had our own challenges, as Joanna will talk about tomorrow, about multiculturalism. But I think there's a lot to be said that conflation of religious identity and historical identity absolutely has happened. Joan of Arc, like any number of ways in which real religious figures are also national heroes. Is going to have an impact on these people, even young people, right, who are believing that. And just one thing about churches in France, as everyone knows, it is a weird thing to go into a church in France when, you're a tourist walking around and there are like eight particularly older people, praying, and you realize there's an actual mass going on here, and people are just wandering through and taking pictures and everything. And this sort of openness of the church and the sort of we know they know that the vast majority of them are owned by the state. I think it definitely has there's some sort of secular attachment to these physical places and this notion of, this is the physical plant that France has, and it has this deep, historical relationship to Catholicism. The young people don't have to believe in any of the religious stuff anymore, but they still like to, when someone comes to visit their town, you go and look at the pretty church. Joanne, I hope I've answered your question there, or at least have touched around the edges of it.
She says, yes, you have.
Oh, well, thank you. You're too kind, Joanna.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Orr, and you can tell
All
us
right.
a little bit about what's coming up after the break.
Well, Paul, up after the break, we are absolutely delighted to welcome our friend Ariane Kinji. She's going to be giving a wonderful talk on the Chinese Uyghur population. This is, again, we are very, lucky is not the right word, right? It's fortuitous that we are giving this talk when we have three countries that really have this front and center. So we look forward to talking about that. I'll talk a little bit about some upcoming programs as well. And we hope all of you can go and get a bite to eat, maybe get something to drink, and we'll see you in a little bit. Thanks for joining.